On August 2, 1928, 11 women at the Games of the Ninth Olympiad in Amsterdam took off from the starting line, and, as it was reported, 5 dropped out before the finish, while 5 collapsed after reaching the tape. Or that's at least what John Tunis, a prominent sports writer of the New York Evening Post, wrote. In reality, there were 9 athletes that raced in the world's first women's Olympic 800-meter final. All athletes finished, and only one dropped to her hands and knees, Canada's Janine Thompson, but she could walk within minutes, a very normal process most runners are more than accustomed to. This sight was not familiar to the early 20th century crowd, though. Women being exerted to the point of falling jarred them. At least the story was captured, right? No harm, no foul. Women finally got to compete in the highest caliber of running events. That couldn't be further from the truth. The sensationalization of this story and distortion of the facts led to a decision by the International Olympic Committee to bar female athletes from competing in anything longer than 200 meters for 32 years. The controversy of women competing in the Olympics goes back to antiquity with the start of the ancient Olympics, which were a group of athletic competitions to honor the Greek god Zeus. Women could not compete, and if a married woman was caught watching, she would be thrown from a mountain. According to Pausanias, a 2nd century CE Greek traveler, there also existed a competition for women, which started in the Archaic period, between 800 and 500 BCE, called the Heraean Games, which were also held in the Olympic Stadium to honor Hera, the wife of Zeus, and the goddess of women, childbirth, marriage, and family. Pausanias also specified that the course of the stadium was shortened by 1/16 for these young unmarried women. There are many other stories from the Greeks and Romans about women competing in athletics, like the Olympics, but it is obvious that these women were the exception, not the norm. This is where Pierre de Coubertin held the first Congress on Physical Education and Scholar Competitions, where he was able to network with politicians, aristocrats, and educators in order to fulfill his vision of a revival of the ancient Greek Olympics. 5 years later, he announced the first Olympics, which were to be held in 1896 in Athens. From the beginning, Pierre heavily opposed women in sport and retained that thinking throughout his career as the president of the International Olympic Committee, or the IOC. Women would not take it, though. The feminist movement was coming to a head at the turn of the century, with New Zealand being the first to allow women to vote in 1873 and the first International Women's Day taking place in 1911. The movement had been gaining traction since the middle of the 19th century, with the first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls in 1848, where civil, social, political, and religious rights for women were called for. When men left their jobs to fight in World War I in 1917, women flooded into factories to take their jobs. This taking on of new roles over time helped edge out the traditionalist views held by many of the role women should play in society. Women were also starting to take even more interest in sports. In 1900, the first women competed in croquet at the Paris Olympic Games, and by 1911 in France, the first women's sports club was set up. This club sponsored matches for soccer, rugby, and biking, and in 1917 hosted the first French national track and field championships. All the owners of female French sports clubs got together and created a female sports federation. Alice Millet became treasurer. Within 3 years, she had become president by unanimous vote and set out to create a space for women to compete internationally. In 1921, she met with women from Sweden, England, Norway, and Italy, where the International Women's Sports Federation, FSFI for short, was born. They planned to set up the Women's Olympics in 1922. The inaugural event hosted 5 countries and allowed its competitors to compete in 11 events. In 1923, the IOC proposed that an international body take over women's athletics because they thought men would be better judges of women's competition. These negotiations were what led to the infamous 11 wretched women who competed in the world's first 800-meter final in 1928. At the 1928 Games, there were 5 events on the track for women: the 100-meter, 4x100-meter relay, 800-meter high jump, and discus throw. The controversy that followed the 800-meter led to the idea of women's track and field being pulled from the Olympic program as a whole being brought up at the following year's IOC annual meeting. The committee decided that the sport put too much strain on women's bodies and decided to allow races for women that were shorter than 200 meters. Millet appealed to the IOC. She asked that they get rid of all women's sports in the Olympics so the FSFI could have full control of women's international competition. They ignored her requests, neither willing to increase the 1936 program to include more events or giving all jurisdiction to the FSFI. Soon, the IAAF had consolidated with the FSFI, ending the 15-year fight Millet had led for women's rights in athletics. The 1940 and 1944 Olympics were canceled because of World War II, so needless to say, there was no need to worry about women being part of the Olympics because there were none. The global increase of women in the workforce because of drafting and men's and military involvement did progress the women's rights movement, though. Now that so many women were working, it only made sense for other aspects of society to catch up. The study of women's athletics still had a long way to go, though.
One summer, I enrolled in a phys ed anatomy kinesiology class at the University of Saskatchewan. The visiting professor from a well-established Eastern USA university lectured about women in athletics. His theory, and he gave no research data, was that girls and young women should not participate in any strenuous athletics because of damage it would cause to their reproductive system. I remember where I sat in that classroom and how I looked at him in disbelief.
After the lost Olympics, the number of women's events slowly increased along with the involvement in social reform. The United States civil rights movement simmered in the mid-1960s. The March on Washington and other protests led to Brown versus the Board of Education, where separate but equal was declared unconstitutional, and the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibited racial segregation in public and most private businesses and barred racial discrimination in education and employment. This act also helped further the cause for women, as they could also no longer be discriminated against in the workplace. The women's movement had just been getting stronger since the 1920s suffragist movement. More women also started to take an active role in protesting sexist beliefs against female athletes, the most notable being Kathrine Switzer, who entered the Boston Marathon in 1967 under the name K.V. Switzer. It was not until she was 2 miles in that officials noticed that she was a woman. She was shoved off the course by officials to try and stop her and disqualified when she did finish the whole marathon. Thanks to changing social ideas, in 1960, the 800-meter was brought back, and the 400-meter made its debut in 1964. Throughout the following years, the pentathlon and 1,500 meters was added. As the civil rights era came to a close, more focus was given to the women's rights movement. In 1972, Title IX was passed. This law required that women get the same opportunities as men, and this meant universities now had to give equal opportunity to female student athletes, both in scholarship money and teams that were available.
I went to University of Maryland in the NCAA. I feel like thanks to Title IX, I felt like that was like heaven compared to anything I had ever experienced. Like, at least, we didn't have as good locker rooms and stuff, but at least we got to go on the trips and we got to get our, scholarships and things.
Though not on a worldwide stage, this law was the result of changing opinion on women's position in society around the world and led to more and more women taking part in high school, college, and later professional and Olympic sports. In January of 1980, the American College of Sports Medicine released a journal titled The Female Athlete in Long Distance Running, and it stated that, quote, there exists no conclusive scientific or medical evidence that long-distance running is contraindicated for the healthy, trained female athlete. This piece of literature was vital to the turning point in long-distance running competition for female athletes in the Olympics.
The year 1984, when I was All-American, that was the first year that they allowed marathon in the Olympic Games that same year. I remember it vividly. Joan Benoit Samuelson won. I still remember being really nervous because there was a lady that finished, but she had some sort of a seizure, like she had maybe dehydration. I just remember just watching that thinking, oh my goodness, after all this time, we're finally allowed to do it, and because they were trying to always make sure women were so safe.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden I see this lady stumbling around the track and I'm going, oh no.
As far as Olympic distance running had come in the past century, there still existed some barriers for women in 1996.
The events for women were different. So the steeplechase and the pole vault they didn't have for women. And then they made the steeplechase an exhibition event for women. And I actually went down and did that event.
Worldwide acceptance of women participating in sports and athletics has come from the women themselves who organized and protested male domination in determining participation in athletics from the local level to Olympic.